Children found a body in the Smuggler's cave. They found him at low tide, in the third cave from the headland. The children were carrying a water-damaged copy of the old Smuggler's rhyme, expecting pirate gold. Instead, the beam of their torch picked out a man face down in the shingle, dressed in a dark wool overcoat and leather city shoes, the sea still wet around his heels. He had not drowned. In his coat pocket was an official customs warrant card. What was a senior exciseman doing in a tidal cave at midnight, holding a rhyme written a century before he was born? Welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, calling in from Ohio, and tonight we're going somewhere cold and old and tidal. A village on the English coast where the cliffs have been keeping a secret for 100 years, and where a children's treasure hunt on a September Tuesday turned up something that was not treasure at all. This is a story about a rhyme that everyone in the village knew, that no one in the village understood. Not until a small, white-haired woman sitting in a rented cottage by the harbor put her knitting down and said very quietly that she thought she might know what it meant. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Has anyone in your family ever passed down a story, a saying, or a piece of knowledge that turned out to mean something entirely different from what you were told? A family phrase you grew up with that you later discovered had a history that no one wanted to explain? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now, the tide is going out, the caves are open, and the children are running. Chapter 1. The Rhyme. Polwheal was not the most dramatic village on that stretch of the Cornish coast, but it had the virtue of unvarnished authenticity. Its harbor was functional rather than picturesque, built of heavy granite blocks that had turned black with 2 centuries of sea spray and coal smoke. Its single public house, the Anchor, smelled of salt, old rope, pipe smoke, and the kind of heavy dark beer that nobody remembers ordering, and everyone finishes out of habit. Its population of 320 souls had, over the generations, developed a relationship with the sea that was entirely practical. The sea was there. It provided fish and trade. It occasionally took boats and men. The appropriate response was careful management, not poetic admiration. The caves, however, were another matter entirely. They had always been cut into the base of the great headland, 3 of them, accessible only at low tide, opening onto the small shingle beach that the village called, without particular imagination, the Low Beach. Local tradition held, with the comfortable confidence of traditions that have never been subjected to rigorous cross-examination, that they had been used by free traders in the 18th century. There were stories, collected by the local antiquarian, Mr. Hector Penhallow, in a self-published monograph of some 30 years standing, and there was the rhyme. The rhyme was the important thing. It existed in several handwritten variations, scattered among family Bibles and attic boxes in the village, none of which agreed precisely with any other, and all of which were believed by local children to be the key to a legendary cache of Spanish gold or French cognac allegedly concealed somewhere in the cavern system during the Napoleonic Wars. It had become, over the decades, the kind of pleasant local lore that furnishes school projects, parish fete programs, and occasional articles in the Truro weekly paper during the quiet winter months. Something nobody quite believed, but which nobody quite dismissed either, on the comfortable grounds that stranger things had been found along the coast. The version in Freddie Bray's jacket pocket was 3 stanzas long. He had copied it from Mr. Penhallow. Penhallow's monograph on a wet Tuesday afternoon in the village reading room, in the neat, deliberate handwriting of a 10-year-old who was being very serious about an undertaking. The first stanza read, "Where the headland shadow falls at noon, and the 3rd door opens to the moon, count 2 tides from the 2nd bell, and the sea gives back what it keeps so well." The 2nd stanza read, "At the voice that echoes, mark the stone, the mark below, the mark alone, what the keeper counts, the keeper hides, the key runs out with the morning tides." The 3rd stanza read, "Hold to the right when the water runs east, Give to the dark what the dark has ceased. Below the shelf where no lantern swings, the old man's trust is in counting things. Freddie had read it aloud to his companions on at least 15 occasions over the previous 3 weeks, with the solemn cadence of a clergyman delivering a sermon, and the effect had not diminished with repetition. He was a boy who took life seriously when he felt a subject deserved it, and he had decided, after studying the stanzas under his desk at school, that pirate gold was a matter of utmost gravity. He was 10 years old and possessed the clear-eyed, unshakable confidence of a boy who has not yet learned that adults are frequently wrong about almost everything. His companions were carefully selected. His sister Nora, aged 8, was the most pragmatically minded member of the group. She brought a trowel, a length of clothesline, and 2 slightly bruised apples, reasoning that any proper expedition required both equipment and sustenance. Arthur Polkinghorne, aged 11, was the oldest, and had therefore been designated expedition leader, though actual command resided in Freddie with the quiet inevitability that always awards leadership to the person who has read the map. Daisy Tremaine, aged 9, carried a notebook bound in oilcloth in which she had copied the rhyme in purple pencil, surrounding the text with elaborate drawings of skull and crossbones, padlocked chests, and anchor motifs, beneath which she had inscribed in block capitals, "The Treasure of Polwheal Cove." They had planned the expedition with military precision. They had studied the printed tide tables posted outside the harbour master's office, which Freddie had monitored for a fortnight, taking notes in the back of his exercise book. They had identified the morning low tide on Tuesday, 8:30, as offering the widest safety margin before the sea returned. They had assigned duties. Arthur had the torch, borrowed from his elder brother's bicycle kit without explicit permission. Nora had the trowel and rope. Daisy had the notebook. Freddie had the text. They had told no adults their precise destination, adhering to the sound childhood principle that adult involvement inevitably transformed an adventure into a supervised walk. They had informed Freddie's mother that they were going to play on the low beach, which was technically accurate regarding their transit route. The first and second caves had proven disappointing. They were shallow, low-ceilinged fissures that smelled powerfully of rotting kelp and damp sand. Their floors were uneven wet shingle, showing no rock marks or shelves that matched the rhyme's cryptic directions. Arthur, whose enthusiasm had begun to wane around 8 o'clock, had suggested twice that they give up and go to the baker's shop to see if any penny buns were ready, but Freddie had pressed onward with grim determination. The third cave was entirely different. It opened wider and higher than the others, its entrance framed by 2 massive pillars of black slate that resembled a ruined doorway. Inside, the floor was composed of fine, dry shingle, real dry shingle that had not been reached by the sea in months. The cavern extended deep into the cliff face, curving gradually to the left, so that after 20 paces the gray daylight from the entrance faded, leaving only the yellow beam of Arthur's torch, cutting through the cool, still air. The ceiling vaulted 10 feet above their heads. It felt less like a sea cave and more like a subterranean hall, quiet and cold and dry. "Look for the shelf," Daisy whispered, her voice echoing softly off the granite walls. "Below the shelf where no lantern swings." Arthur swung the torch beam along the right-hand wall. The rock was smooth, worn flat by ancient water action, until it stepped out into a flat stone ledge about chest-high. "There's a ledge," Nora said, pointing with her trowel. Freddie took the torch from Arthur's hand and shone it past the ledge, into the darker recess where the cavern narrowed into a blind alley. The beam picked out 2 dark leather shoes lying sideways on the shingle. Above the shoes was a man's body. He was lying face down, perfectly motionless. He wore a dark wool overcoat and dark trousers, completely unsuited to coastal exploring. His left hand was outstretched, fingers slightly curled into the shingle as if he had reached for something in his final second. For 3 seconds, none of the 4 children moved. The only sound was the distant rhythmic thrum of the sea outside the cave entrance. Then Nora dropped her trowel. It hit the stones with a sharp clatter. "He's not asleep," Arthur said, in a voice that didn't sound like his own. Freddie didn't answer. He backed away slowly, keeping the torch beam fixed on the motionless dark shape until they reached the curve of the cave. Then he turned, grabbed Nora's hand, and ran. They ran across the dry shingle, past the black slate pillars, across the wet stones of the low beach, and up the steep winding cliff path, without stopping or looking back. They reached the top of the harbor lane, out of breath, white-faced, and trembling, where they collided directly with Mrs. Tremaine, who was coming out of the post office with a basket of eggs. It was Mrs. Tremaine who took one look at Daisy's face, dropped her basket, and marched them straight to Sergeant Bassett at the police station. Chapter 2. The Exciseman. Detective Constable Greaves arrived from Truro at 10:30, in a mud-splattered police Morris Oxford. Sergeant Bassett of the Polwheal Constabulary met him at the harbour wall with the expression of a man who has been briefly in charge of something that has suddenly expanded beyond his professional capacity. Bassett was a solid, decent man of 45, who had been stationed in Polwheal for 11 years. His professional routine had previously encompassed, without undue strain, straying sheep, disputed fish crate ownership, and the occasional rowdy customer outside the Anchor on a Saturday evening after the pubs closed. A dead body in the cliff caves was a different category of reality entirely, and Bassett felt the weight of it in his shoulders. "He's still down there, sir," Bassett said, adjusting his helmet nervously as Greaves stepped out of the motor car. "I posted Constable Harris at the cliff top to keep the village people back. Mrs. Tremaine's boy and the others found him at 9. I haven't touched a thing." "Good man," Greaves said. He was 27, sharp-featured, with keen dark eyes and a neat raincoat. He had been with the Truro CID for 3 years after transferring from Bristol, and he possessed the methodical, quiet efficiency of the new generation of police officers who relied on physical evidence and timeline reconstruction rather than local gossip. The examination of the scene and the body was conducted by Dr. Penrose, the police surgeon from Truro, who arrived 20 minutes later. The doctor spent 40 minutes inside the third cave, while Greaves sketched the layout and noted the position of the tide. Dr. Penrose's initial findings were concise. The deceased had not drowned. There was no seawater in his lungs or stomach. Death was caused by a severe fracture to the base of the skull, produced by a heavy blunt impact from behind. The blow had been struck while the victim was standing or crouching near the stone ledge. "Was it a fall?" Greaves asked, leaning over the body in the torchlight. "Possible," Dr. Penrose noted, scrupulously, "if he struck that granite outcrop as he fell. But the angle of the depression, and the absence of scuff marks on his trousers, suggests he was struck from behind, by someone standing over him. I shall know more after the post-mortem, but if I were you, Constable, I should look for a heavy weapon." The body was identified before noon, from official papers in his inside coat pocket, a leather warrant card holder, and a district ID card. His name was James Kellaway, aged 39, senior inspector with Her Majesty's Customs and Excise, attached to the Truro Regional Investigation Officers Division. When Greaves telephoned the Truro Excise Office from the police station, Kellaway's divisional chief expressed immediate shock and confusion. Kellaway had officially reported taking 3 days of annual leave to visit relatives in Exeter. He had no official assignment in Polwheal. No warrant had been issued for a search in the district. Greaves wrote Kellaway's name in his notebook, drew a heavy circle around it, and added 3 question marks. A senior customs officer did not lie to his superior officer about his whereabouts and travel to an isolated coastal village on his own time, unless he was pursuing a private, unofficial lead. A lead he could not report through official channels without risking a tip-off to his suspects. Kellaway had come to Polwheal quietly because he believed someone in Polwheal was running an illicit operation, and he had gone into the third cave on Monday night to catch them in the act. and someone had been waiting for him in the dark. By early afternoon, the village was humming like a disturbed beehive. Mrs. Tremaine had recounted the children's discovery to Mrs. Pengelly at the Anchor, who had passed it to the postmistress, who had relayed it to every parishioner buying stamps. By 2 o'clock, everyone in Polwheal knew that the dead man was a government official, and that he had been found in the third cave. "The third cave," Mrs. Pengelly remarked to Sergeant Bassett when he came into the Anchor tap-room for a sandwich. "The one people always talked about, in connection with old Mr. Penhallow's rhyme. The third door opens to the moon," Mr. Penhallow himself chimed in from his corner table, where he was sipping a mineral water. Stanza 1, line 2. "I've always said the third cave was the focal point of the entire legend." Miss Marple sat nearby in a comfortable armchair by the hearth, her silver knitting needles clicking softly as a pale blue woolen scarf took shape in her lap. She had arrived in Polwheal 4 days earlier to stay with her dear friend Dorothea Carn, whose seaside cottage offered fresh sea air recommended for Miss Marple's lingering winter cough. She listened to the chatter with the quiet, absorbed attention she usually reserved for parish gossip in St. Mary Mead. She noted the exact words used: the dry one. If the third cave stayed dry above the high tide line, it was the only cavern in the headland where goods could be stored safely without water damage. She looked across the room at Mrs. Pengelly behind the bar. Mrs. Pengelly was wiping a glass with energetic vigor, but her eyes kept darting toward the window whenever a car passed outside. And in the corner, Mr. Gregory Farr, the quiet writer who lived in Penrose's cottage, was turning the pages of his newspaper with a slow, deliberate rhythm that suggested he was not reading the print at all, but listening to every single word spoken in the room. Miss Marple smiled faintly, dropped 2 stitches, picked them up with practiced ease, and continued to knit. Chapter 3. The Boathouse. The village of Polwheal supported, along with the Anchor public house and Mrs. Pengelly's general shop and Mr. Penhallow's antiquarian bookshop on the upper street, a working boathouse at the harbour's western end, operated by the Trevelyan family. The Trevelyans had been in Polwheal for as long as anyone remembered, which in a village with a continuous inhabitation of 3 centuries was saying something of real weight. Thomas Trevelyan's grandfather had operated fishing boats from the same harbour. His father had expanded into boat hire and small coastal tours when the fishing declined. Thomas himself had continued both functions, adding minor boat repairs to the services on offer. And the combined effect was a business that was embedded in the village's economic fabric in the way that only 3-generation enterprises can be. Unquestioned, assumed, invisible in the specific way of things that have always been there. The current generation consisted of Thomas Trevelyan, 51, a broad, dark, quiet man who maintained the boathouse with the competent efficiency of someone who knows exactly what he's doing and sees no reason to discuss it. His wife Irene, who was rarely at the harbour and was said to prefer the garden, and their son Matthew, 23, who had the lean, watchful quality of someone who has learned to be careful from people who were careful, and who helped his father in the boathouse with a dedication that various observers in the village had noted was more consistent than any young man's enthusiasm for inherited manual labor usually sustained. Thomas Trevelyan was not a man who invited conversation. He had the quality of someone whose relationship with the village was conducted on an entirely practical basis. He provided a service, the village used the service, and any engagement beyond that was unnecessary. He was also, and this was the observation Miss Marple made on her second visit to the harbour on Wednesday morning, a man who was not surprised by the discovery of Kellaway's body. This was a subtle thing, the absence of the particular quality of surprise, and she had learned over many years to notice absences as carefully as presences. He had heard the news. He had nodded. He had gone back to what he was doing. Not the nod of a man who has processed a shock and is managing it. The nod of a man who is processing a known development. Matthew Trevelyan was a different matter. He had the coiled, alert quality of someone who is keeping something under tight control, which was distinct from the calm of someone with nothing to keep under control. And the two could generally be distinguished if one paid the right kind of attention. He moved around the harbor with a slightly excessive awareness of who was where, the kind of monitoring that is invisible when a person has nothing to hide, and becomes visible when they do. She had a theory by Wednesday afternoon that was in its broad outline probably correct. She did not regard it as confirmed because it required evidence that she did not yet have, and the distance between a probable theory and a confirmed one was the distance between a useful observation and something that could actually help the police find who had killed James Kellaway. The boathouse itself was a large functional building with good water access and high double doors facing the harbor, with a secondary entrance on the landward side opening onto the back lane. Its storage capacity was considerable. A working boathouse needed space for boats, for equipment, for fuel, for the various materials of coastal operation, and the Trevian boathouse had been built by Thomas's grandfather with the instinct of a man who understood that adequate storage was the foundation of a sound business. Miss Marple observed it from the harbor wall on Wednesday morning while ostensibly looking at the sea and knitting. She observed the fresh wheel marks in the mud at the back lane entrance, deep marks from something considerably heavier than the vehicles normally involved in coastal fishing and tourism, and recent enough that the rain had not yet softened their edges. She observed that Matthew Trevian went inside the boathouse at 9:30 and remained there without emerging until nearly 11, with no visible result in the form of activity, goods moved, or maintenance conducted. She observed the quality of the lock on the back lane entrance, which was a heavy commercial padlock of the type used to secure things one cannot afford to have opened by the incurious. She also took occasion, at 11 o'clock, to walk slowly down the back lane herself, holding her umbrella against the light drizzle and pausing near the boathouse's landward door to adjust her knitted shawl. Matthew Trevian came out through the small side door, carrying a coil of tarred line. When he saw her, his entire body stiffened, a subtle reaction, but one that Miss Marple registered immediately. "Good morning, Matthew," she said, with the warm, slightly vague smile she kept for young men who looked flustered. "It is Matthew, isn't it? Mrs. Carn was speaking so highly of your father's boat hire." "Yes, ma'am," Matthew said, holding the rope against his thigh. He did not smile back. His eyes were restless, glancing past her shoulder toward the harbor lane. "Can I help you with something? It's wet out here for walking." "Oh, I am taking my doctor's prescribed stroll," she said blithely. "Fresh air for the chest, you know. I was just admiring this splendid old building. Your grandfather built it, I believe. It looks extraordinarily sturdy." "It's sturdy enough," the young man said shortly. "And so commodious," Miss Marple exclaimed, looking up at the high wooden double doors of the rear bay. "You must be able to store a great deal in there, not just boats, I suppose, but all sorts of crates and equipment. My cousin Arthur had a boathouse on the Solent, and I remember he used to say that a good dry storeroom behind the boat slips was worth its weight in gold, especially for goods that couldn't be left out in the salt air." Matthew's jaw tightened. "We only keep boat gear, ma'am. Oars, nets, fuel drums." Of course," she agreed smoothly, "though I did notice a motor van parked near the lane entrance yesterday evening, a van from Truro, I think it was. Rawlings, Wines and Spirits. I wondered whether your father was taking delivery of something for the anchor, or perhaps for Mr. Penrose up on the hill." The reaction was brief but unmistakable. Matthew Trevian's color drained slightly, and his fingers clenched into the rough hemp of the rope. "I wouldn't know about any van," he said, stepping back toward the doorway. "Dad handles all the deliveries. If you'll excuse me, ma'am, I've got work inside." He retreated behind the heavy door and slid the interior bolt into place with a sharp, heavy thud. Miss Marple stood in the lane for a moment, her umbrella dripping softly in the rain. She did not need to see inside the boathouse. The young man's fear had told her almost everything she needed to know. The boathouse was not merely a repair shop, it was the shoreside transfer point. The goods came out of the third cave by boat, passed into the boathouse through the sea doors under cover of dark, and were loaded into commercial vans at the landward entrance, before the village woke up. She also observed, and noted with particular interest, that a van belonging to Rawlings Wines and Spirits of Truro was parked at the end of the back lane on Tuesday evening, which she knew because she had been taking a rather further evening walk than Mrs. Carney considered advisable for a woman recovering from a winter cold, and had seen it parked there at 8:30, after dark, without its engine running, as though it were waiting for something. Rawlings Wines and Spirits was the name on the invoices she had seen on the desk in the anchor's back office, seen almost inadvertently through a door left open while Mrs. Pengelly was fetching her tea, and the quantities on those invoices had remained in her memory with the precision that always attended figures that did not quite make sense. The invoices had shown quarterly deliveries of a volume that was, for a pub of the anchor's size and custom, significantly in excess of what 3 days' observation suggested the clientele could account for. She had counted the chairs, and estimated the average occupancy, and applied a reasonable estimate of consumption per person per evening, and the figures were irreconcilable. Either Mrs. Pengelly was buying stock she could not sell through the anchor alone, or the anchor was serving as an accounting conduit for a broader distribution network. Miss Marple was reminded of Mr. Henderson in St. Mary Mead, who had run the village drapery shop for 22 years with immaculate balance sheets that always showed a modest loss, until it was discovered that he was supplying 3 unlicensed tailors in Nether Addington with bolts of cloth that had never officially passed through his storefront. Mr. Henderson had been a most respectable churchwarden, but he possessed an arithmetic imagination that could not resist an unmonitored profit margin. Mrs. Pengelly, she reflected, possessed the same sort of imagination very much. She did not conclude from this that Mrs. Pengelly was drinking 3 times the expected quantity herself. She concluded something considerably more organized and far more dangerous. Chapter 4. The Newcomer. Gregory Farr had come to Polwheal in March, renting a well-situated cottage on the upper lane from a farmer named Penrose. Penrose had been renting the cottage out for 3 seasons, and found Farr satisfactory in every practical dimension. Punctual with the rent, modest in his electrical consumption, no noisy companions, no suspicious visitors. He bought his bread from the baker, his morning newspaper from the post office, and took an occasional half-pint at the anchor in the evening, with the cheerful, sociable regularity of a man who has no reason to avoid being seen, and every reason to be seen being unremarkable. He described himself as a writer, engaged on a book about the Cornish coast's maritime history, which gave him an unassailable reason to talk to people about local customs, tides, and shipping records, and to be seen along the shoreline at hours that might otherwise attract inquiry. He had, by his own account, been researching the project for 18 months, and had chosen Polwheal for its concentration of preserved maritime tradition. He had spoken to Mr. Penhallow at length, borrowed several items from the bookshop's archive with appropriate receipts, and spent hours sitting on the harbour wall with a leather-bound notebook. He had, by all surface appearances, been doing exactly what he professed to do. Miss Marple's difficulty with him was not that he was suspicious in any observable way. It was that he was consistently and uniformly credible in a way that real human beings, in her long experience, almost never were. Real people had jagged edges, topics they pursued with disproportionate enthusiasm, subjects they avoided with sudden stiffness, small inconsistencies between their stated background and their unconscious habits, days when they were more guarded or more weary than usual. Real people slipped into local idioms or revealed unexpected domestic anxieties. Gregory Farr had none of these flaws. He was smoothly, continuously, flawlessly agreeable. This polished perfection had a quality she had encountered before in St. Mary Mead, not in the majority of villagers, who were imperfect in the natural, unmanaged ways of persons with nothing to conceal. But in Mr. Raymond's former secretary, Arthur Vance, Vance had possessed impeccable references, an immaculate suit, and an unshakable politeness, right up to the moment it was discovered that he had 3 separate wives living in different railway towns and had been systematically falsifying trust accounts for 4 years. A man whose public persona contains not a single crack is usually a man who spends a great deal of energy maintaining the plaster. She talked with Gregory Farr in the snug of the Anchor on Wednesday evening. Or rather, he talked to her, which she noted carefully, because people with nothing to hide do not generally take a sustained, probing interest in what elderly visiting spinster is doing with her holiday. St. Mary Mead must be very quiet, he said, offering her a glass of sherry, which she accepted with a mild, fluttery expression of gratitude. I imagine a coastal village like this feels quite different from the home counties. Oh, it is very quiet, Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles clicking with rhythmic precision, though human nature, I have found, is surprisingly similar everywhere. My dear friend Mrs. Badger used to say that whether one is in a village in Hampshire or a fishing hamlet in Devon, people always have their little routines, don't they, and their little secrets. She looked up at him over her spectacles with wide, innocent blue eyes. Though, of course, in St. Mary Mead, we don't have maritime history. It must be fascinating work, writing a book. Do you find the local records here complete? Extremely complete, he said smoothly. Mr. Penhallow has been most generous. The history of these small coves is quite rich. Take Crantock Bay, for instance. The sheer volume of 18th-century cargo that passed through there is astonishing. He paused, a tiny, almost imperceptible pause. Crantock Bay was 5 miles to the north, beyond the headland, invisible from Polwheal, and had not been mentioned by anyone in the Anchor that evening. Of course, he added at once, with an easy smile, one reads about Crantock in the Ordnance Survey maps and the district histories. It catches the eye. Indeed it must, Miss Marple murmured, dropping a stitch and retrieving it with practiced ease. Maps are so terribly informative. My nephew Raymond always says that a good map tells you not only where things are, but where people expect you to go. She noted, as the conversation continued, that whenever the topic touched upon the local police or the arrival of Detective Constable Greaves from Truro, Gregory Farr's tone shifted ever so slightly, not into overt curiosity, but into an easy, dismissive amusement, as though police investigations were a slightly tedious administrative exercise that occasionally inconvenienced quiet villages. A tragic business about that poor man found in the caves, Farr remarked, gazing thoughtfully into his ale. An inspector of excise, they say. One wonders what a government official was doing wandering around tidal caverns after dark. It seems remarkably careless for a man of his age. Very careless, Miss Marple agreed softly. Or perhaps very deliberate. Sometimes, Mr. Farr, people go into dark places, not because they are careless, but because they have reason to believe they will find something specific. Farr looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were light gray, steady, and entirely devoid of the mild warmth his smile projected. I suppose that is possible, he said, though in my experience, people who go searching in dark places usually find more than they bargained for. Chapter 5. The Second Tide. Mr. Hector Penhallow was 63, and had been something of a fixture in Polwheal since his retirement from the county archives 7 years ago, which had been the culmination of a professional life devoted to making other people's research easier and his own research impossible to conduct during office hours. Now that the hours were his own, he had produced in the 7 years of his retirement 3 additional local history pamphlets, the revised edition of his Smugglers monograph, and an ongoing card index system of cross-references that he had come to regard as his major work. He was a small man, quick-moving, with the rapid, interested manner of someone who has found, late in life, the one subject about which they know more than anyone else, and intends to remain in close proximity to it indefinitely. He was also, and Miss Marple had noted this in her first encounter with him in the Anchor on Tuesday evening, a genuinely curious person. He was not only interested in what he knew, he was interested in what he didn't know, and in the possibility that what he knew might be incomplete. This quality, which she found in perhaps one scholar in 5, and in almost no local antiquarians, made him considerably more useful than he would otherwise have been. She found him in his bookshop on Thursday morning, shelving a delivery of second-hand volumes, with the careful attention of a man for whom books are primary documents of lived experience. The shop smelled pleasantly of old calfskin, damp paper, and wood smoke from the small stove in the corner. Penhallow was wearing a green wool cardigan, with a pencil tucked behind his left ear, and he had a cup of tea balanced on a shelf in a way that suggested the balance was temporary, but had been stable for some time. She asked him to tell her what he thought the rhyme actually meant. Not what it said, what it meant in practice. He stopped shelving and looked at her over his wire-rimmed spectacles, a volume of 1840 parish records suspended in his right hand. "You don't think it's about gold," he said. "I'm not sure I know what it's about," she said, taking the armchair near the stove. "Penhallow reserved for serious visitors. But I read your monograph. Very thorough, Mr. Penhallow, really quite remarkable. And I noticed that you discussed, in a footnote on page 14, the possibility that smugglers sometimes encoded their operational procedures in verse." He set down the parish records. He looked, she thought, slightly startled that she had read the footnote. Footnotes being, in his experience, the part of a monograph that receives the least attention from casual readers, serving primarily as decorative proof of academic rigor. "I dismissed that possibility," he said slowly, rubbing his chin. "I considered it an over-elaboration. Smuggling in the 1790s was a rough, illiterate trade. Verse implies a literary inclination that seemed inconsistent with men who spent their nights hauling kegs of brandy up cliff paths." "Unless," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the verse was composed not by the men hauling the kegs, but by the person managing the business from an office or a parlor. My Uncle Henry used to say that the most efficient farmers in Norfolk were those who wrote down their crop rotations in rhyming couplets for their bailiffs to memorize, because a bailiff who could not read a ledger could easily remember a verse." She produced her copy of the rhyme from her bag. "Let us try the first stanza with the operational interpretation," she said. "Where the headland shadow falls at noon, that's a time marker and an alignment guide. At noon, the headland's shadow falls in a specific direction across the bay, which indicates a specific approach line for a boat coming in from the sea. And the third door opens to the moon. The third cave has an opening position to catch the moonlight at a particular phase, which is relevant if you are navigating in by night without lanterns." Penhallow came out from behind the counter. He took a seat opposite her, his eyes fixed on the paper. "Count 2 tides from the second bell," she continued. "A tidal schedule. 2 tidal cycles from the 6 o'clock evening parish bell, which puts the operation at a consistent, predictable window, the same window each time. And the sea gives back what it keeps so well. The cave is above the high tide line, so the sea keeps the goods, in the sense that the cave entrance is protected by the tide from casual inspection by land patrollers." "Good Lord," Penhallow whispered. "The second stanza," Miss Marple went on, her voice calm and conversational, "is about marking and inventory. At the voice that echoes, mark the stone, a specific stone near the echo point inside the cave. The mark below, the mark alone, a tally mark carved or chalked on the cave wall below a natural watermark. What the keeper counts, the keeper hides. What the local keeper counts is what is stored, under the direction of the coordinator. The key runs out with the morning tides. The safe window for working the cave closes with the incoming morning tide, so the shore party must be finished and clear by dawn." She looked at Mr. Penhallow. His hands were gripping his knees. The third stanza is the most operationally specific of all, she said. Hold to the right when the water runs east, a directional instruction for navigating the interior channel. Below the shelf, where no lantern swings, a specific storage location, a natural ledge, below the level at which you would hang a lamp, which means the goods stored there are hidden in shadow when viewed from the cave entrance. And the old man's trust is in counting things. The coordinator relies on accurate inventory management. Mr. Penhallow sat in complete silence for a long minute. The clock on the wall ticked with dry precision. If that reading is correct, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, then it is not a romantic legend at all. It is an instruction manual. Schedule, approach vector, storage location, inventory protocol, safety window. He looked up at her, his eyes wide. Written in verse so it could be memorized by illiterate boatmen, and disguised as a folk legend so it could be carried openly without raising suspicion. Precisely, Miss Marple said. If a preventive officer finds a man carrying a poem about pirate gold, he laughs and calls him a dreamer. If he finds a man carrying a set of tidal logistics instructions for uncustomed spirits, he arrests him. The caves haven't changed, Penhallow said, his voice rising slightly as the logic took hold. The headland shadow falls in the exact same line. The church bell still rings at 6. The third cave still has that shelf. I catalogued it myself. A natural granite ledge, 4 feet above the floor, obscured by the rock shoulder on the right wall. He stood up, paced to the window, and looked down toward the harbor. Someone didn't just read my monograph to study history, he said, turning back to her with a look of profound shock. Someone read my monograph because it gave them the key to an operational system that is still completely functional today. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. And when Inspector Kellaway came to Polwheal, he was not looking for pirate gold. He was looking for the man who was currently using that instruction manual. Chapter 6. Mrs. Pengelly's Books. The anchor's accounts were not, strictly speaking, Miss Marple's concern, and she was not in possession of them in any official sense. What she was in possession of was a habit of memory, which had noted and retained the figures from the invoices in Mrs. Pengelly's back office, and a habit of arithmetic, which had applied those figures to the observable facts of the anchor's custom. She had, in addition, spent Wednesday afternoon in a manner that would have appeared aimless to any observer, but which was in fact quite purposeful. She had visited the post office to buy stamps, during which she had inquired after the availability of a particular brand of tobacco for a friend, which gave her a reason to spend 12 minutes in conversation with the postmistress. She had visited Mr. Penhallow's bookshop to return the monograph she had borrowed, which gave her a reason to examine the visitor's book kept by the bookshop for people who borrowed from the archive. And she had stopped at Mrs. Pengelly's general shop to buy a ball of wool, which gave her a reason to be behind the counter while Mrs. Pengelly located it in the storage room, and to observe, without appearing to observe, the condition of the storeroom itself. The storeroom had a quantity of stock that was inconsistent with the shop's surface business. Not dramatically inconsistent. It would not have struck anyone not already thinking along specific lines. But the particular bottles she noticed in the rear were not labeled with Rawlings wines and spirits, and they were not the bottles one expected to see in a general shop's provisions range, and there were rather more of them than the shop's occasional alcohol license would account for. She raised the subject with D.C. Greaves on Thursday afternoon, in a conversation that began with her asking him, pleasantly, whether the police had had occasion to look at the village's business accounts in the course of their investigation. Greaves, who was 27 and had the slightly harassed quality of someone who has been handed a great deal more than he expected, said that the investigation had focused primarily on the immediate circumstances of Kellaway's death. Miss Marple said that was entirely sensible, and that she hoped she wasn't being a nuisance, and that she had noticed something that might or might not be relevant. And would he like her to tell him? He said he would. He had been in Polwheal for 3 days, and had found that the most useful conversations he had were with an elderly woman who appeared to be knitting continuously throughout all of them. She told him about the invoices and the storeroom stock. She told him about the boathouse and the Rawlings van. She told him about the rhyme and its operational interpretation and what it implied about the title schedule currently in use. She did not, at this stage, mention Gregory Farr directly. She did not yet have enough to be specific in a way that was fair. But she said that the operation required a coordinator, someone who managed the quantities and timing, and that a coordinator would have a reason to be at the harbor at regular intervals that was not explicable by either fishing or tourism. The question of how the goods arrive, she said, is a maritime one. The caves are accessible by sea. A boat at the right tide, at the right hour, and the rhyme provides both. The question of who manages the schedule from the shoreside is a different one, and I think it's the more important question for finding who killed Mr. Kellaway. Because Kellaway was looking for the shoreside manager, not just the boat. I think that's likely, Miss Marple said. A senior inspector of his experience would understand that the physical operation, the boat, the cave, the storage, is replaceable. The management is what sustains it. He would have been looking for the person who could tell him how large the operation was, and how long it had been running. And whoever that person is, they knew Kellaway was looking. Greaves went to get a search warrant for the boathouse. He found, in the section behind the stored boats, behind a false partition constructed with the particular competence of a person who has done this before, and knows that a casual inspection won't find it, a very considerable quantity of spirits, whiskey, brandy, and gin in unlabeled bottles, crated and stacked in neat rows on shelving, that had been installed specifically for the purpose. Not gold, never gold. Thomas Trevine was taken into custody on Thursday evening. His son Matthew went with him, protesting that he knew nothing about the death, which was possibly true, and which Greaves noted without yet evaluating. The Anchor's back office was searched the following morning. Mrs. Pengelly, who had run the pub for 18 years with the unquestioned authority of someone who has occupied a position long enough that the position has become the person, was interviewed at length. The interview was not comfortable for either party, but it was productive. The mechanism, as it emerged, was straightforward. The Trevine boat made the cave run on the title schedule the rhyme described. The goods came out of the cave to the boathouse. The boathouse repackaged them with minimal but serviceable provenance. Rawlings Wines and Spirits provided the legitimate-looking invoice trail, and the Anchor and 2 other establishments in the wider district received the product at prices that made the arrangement worth the risk to everyone involved. This distribution system had functioned, under its present commercial arrangement, for roughly 24 months. It had been running in a vaguer, less efficient form for considerably longer. Thomas Trevine's knowledge of the caves and their tidal behavior was, one inferred, inherited knowledge. The question of who had organized the current, efficient iteration, and who had known that James Kellaway was close enough to the truth that he could not be allowed to complete his inquiry, was a different and more pointed question. Chapter 7. The Old Rhyme. Freddie Bray came to the cottage on Saturday morning, alone, without his companions, which suggested he had decided on this visit independently, and did not wish to manage an audience. He knocked on the door with the purposeful knock of a child who has made up his mind about something. Miss Marple answered the door and invited him in for a biscuit, which he accepted with the focused appreciation of a child who regards biscuits as a serious matter and does not pretend otherwise. Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table with the particular uprightness of someone who has come to say something important and wants to be taken seriously. He produced his copy of the rhyme from his jacket pocket, still water-damaged, somewhat further deteriorated than it had been a week ago, but still legible in his own careful handwriting, and laid it on the table. "The counting," he said, "in the 3rd stanza. The old man's trust is in counting things. There isn't an old man who counts things in the caves. There's someone who counts things in the village, though." Miss Marple set down her teacup and gave Freddie Bray the kind of attention that she gave to people who said things that turned out to be correct. "Tell me," she said. "Mr. Farr counts things," Freddie said. "He counts them in his notebook. I've been watching him, not on purpose at first, but then on purpose, because it seemed interesting. He goes to the harbor on certain days, and he counts the boats, and he writes numbers in his notebook in a way that isn't like writing for a book. When you're writing for a book, you write words and sentences. He's writing numbers in columns. I've seen the notebook from the wall. He doesn't notice people watching him from the wall." A brief pause, which suggested this had been a deliberate strategy. "He goes at the same times. Not every day. Certain days. The days when the Trevian boat goes out in the evening." In her experience, the most significant evidence in a case was sometimes delivered by the person with no investment in what it meant, who simply reported what they had seen without interpretation, because they lacked the framework to interpret it. Freddie Bray lacked the framework entirely, which made his account of the notebooks exceptionally reliable. Also, Freddie said, on the Monday before the Tuesday, Mr. Farr was not at his cottage in the evening. I know because Nora and I walked up the upper lane after tea, because Nora wanted to look at the Trevian dog, which is kept in the lane. And we went past Mr. Farr's cottage at about 7:30, and the lights were off. And at 8, I checked when we came back." He looked at her steadily. "He told Sergeant Bassett he was at home all evening. He said it when Bassett was talking to everyone on the upper lane on Wednesday morning. But he wasn't. He was somewhere else." Miss Marple offered Freddie a second biscuit, which he accepted. "You've been very observant," she said, "and I think you are quite right about the counting." She looked at the rhyme. "The old man's trust is in counting things." The rhyme was written in the previous century, and there was a man who counted then, a manager, an accountant of the operation. The rhyme doesn't require the same man, it requires the same function. Someone who counts, who manages the quantities, who coordinates what happens and when. The counting was the management function, not the physical work of the cave or the boat, but the coordination that made the physical work efficient and the financial benefit real. The Trevians provided the local knowledge and the maritime access. Mrs. Pengelly provided the distribution mechanism. Rawlings Wines and Spirits provided the cover. What all of this required, to run safely, at scale, without drawing attention, was someone who could see the whole operation from outside it, who was not visibly connected to any single element, and who could coordinate without appearing to coordinate. A writer, researching local maritime history, with a very good reason to know the tides, to be at the harbor, to be in conversation with the boatman and the innkeeper, to have a notebook full of numbers. The Rawlings invoices had begun showing their unusual volumes in March. Gregory Farr had arrived in March. This was not a coincidence, it was a commencement date. And James Kellaway, coming to the village informally, without registering his visit, looking for the coordinator rather than the physical operation, would have spoken to Farr as a local resident who knew people and places, who appeared knowledgeable, who was friendly and helpful, who had, in the course of being helpful, understood precisely what Kellaway was looking for, and that Kellaway was very close to finding it. She thanked Freddie and suggested that he might tell D.C. Greaves directly what he had observed, because Greaves was thorough and the information about Monday evening was important. Freddie left with the slightly elevated bearing of a person who has contributed materially to a serious investigation. She watched him go from the cottage doorway, and then went inside to get her knitting bag and her coat. Chapter 8. The Third Cave. She found him, not at his cottage but at the harbor, sitting on the wall with a notebook in his lap, and the long practice ease of someone who is exactly where they expected to be. It was Saturday afternoon, the tide was going out, and the caves were beginning to become accessible along the base of the headland. She sat beside him on the harbor wall, with the lack of self-consciousness of someone who sits on harbor walls as a matter of course, and produced her knitting. The sea was gray and running a short chop from the southwest. A pair of oyster catchers worked the exposed shingle below the wall. The harbor was quiet. "The rhyme is rather good," she said after a moment, in the tone of continuing a conversation that had not in fact begun. He looked at her. "I'm sorry?" "The Smugglers' rhyme." She counted a stitch. "It's very cleverly done, a century old, and still perfectly operational. The person who wrote it was a practical thinker. Everything in it is observable fact, dressed up as local color. Nobody looks hard at something they already think they understand." A silence. She could feel, without looking at him, the quality of the attention he was giving her. It was the attention of someone who has not yet decided whether this is a problem. "I've been thinking about the third stanza particularly," she said. "The old man's trust is in counting things. Everything else in the rhyme describes the physical operation, when to go, which way to approach, where to store. That last line describes the person who manages it all, the coordinator, the one who knows the quantities and the timing and what is expected from whom." She looked at her knitting. "The accountant, one might say, though accountant is a rather dry word for someone who has to manage the coordination of a boat route, a boathouse, and a distribution chain across 3 establishments in 2 counties. It was a very small change, and he controlled it with the practice of someone accustomed to concealment, but she was listening for it. A writer researching maritime history," she continued, in the same pleasant ruminative tone, "would make an excellent operational manager. The note-taking explained, the harbor visits explained, the knowledge of tides and boat schedules explained, and, which is important, a newcomer rather than a local. A local who knows things is a local known to know things, which eventually becomes a liability. A newcomer who knows things is simply someone who has done research." He was very still now. Mr. Kellaway needed to speak to someone who could help him understand the caves, she said. He had been in the village for several days before Monday. He had spoken to various people. A friendly, knowledgeable researcher with an interest in the local maritime history would have been a natural person to consult. And you would have known, very quickly, exactly how close he was to what you needed him not to find. "Miss Marple," he said, and his voice was very level, with the controlled quality of a man applying a professional calibration to his register. "You're describing a great deal that I'm not certain you have any actual evidence for." "You're right that I don't have the evidence," she said. "D.C. Greaves has the evidence, or is in the process of acquiring it. The boathouse has been searched. Mrs. Pengelly's accounts are being examined. The Trevians are in custody and are being asked at some length about the management of the operation over the past 2 years. She looked at him with the steady blue eyes that had produced confessions from people considerably more composed than Gregory Farr. "There is also the matter of the ledger found in the boathouse, which contains inventory entries in a handwriting that will be matched, and the notebooks that you have been keeping in a manner that Sergeant Bassett found interesting when he visited your cottage this morning." This was not entirely accurate. Bassett had visited the cottage, but the notebook analysis was still pending. But it was accurate enough to be useful, and she had found over many years that a statement which is almost entirely true has very much the same effect as a statement which is completely true, in the right circumstances. He stood up. Not quickly, deliberately, with the measured deliberation of a man who is assessing options and finding them fewer than expected. Mr. Kellaway had uncovered sufficient detail that his departure from the village became an urgent necessity for the network, she said. "That is not something I am guessing. It is something that follows from the facts of his presence in the village on Monday evening and the particular location in which he was found. He was in the right cave. He was there at the right time. He had been led there, I think, by someone who appeared to be helping him." "You cannot prove that either." "Not today," she agreed. "But a man who is sitting on a harbor wall making notes in a notebook on a Saturday afternoon, when the men he has been working with are being interviewed in Truro and a thorough detective constable is examining the accounts, is a man who has rather fewer options than he imagines." She picked up her knitting bag with the comfortable motion of someone who has said what she intended to say. "I've asked D.C. Greaves to come to the harbor at 4 o'clock. If you're here, it will be helpful. If you're not, they do find people as a general rule. She looked at the sea for a moment, at the receding tide, and the caves beginning to open at the base of the cliff. The tide is going out, she said. The caves are open. It seems an appropriate time for things that have been hidden to become visible. She walked back along the harbor wall, toward Mrs. Carne's cottage, without hurrying, because there was no need to hurry, and the sea was clear, and the oyster-catchers were still working the shingle, and it was, all in all, a very decent September afternoon. He was still on the harbor wall at 4 o'clock. D.C. Greaves arrived at 3 minutes past, and Sergeant Bassett 2 minutes after that. And Gregory Farr, whose real name, as the record showed, was Gerald Rowe, with a history in coastal logistics that was considerably more practical than any published writing career, and 2 previous addresses in Bristol and Plymouth that the excise records found useful, provided, over the following hours, the information required to make the case complete. Chapter 9. The Counting. The complete picture, as it emerged over the following week in the statements and searches and professional communications between the Polwheal Inquiry and the Truro District Office of Customs and Excise, was this. The cave operation had been running, in its current organized form, for approximately 2 years, since Gerald Rowe's arrival in Polwheal in March of the previous year. Before Rowe, the arrangement had existed in a vaguer form, a family practice of the Trevians, going back at least a generation, opportunistic and small scale, a boat, a cave, a quantity of spirits moved at intervals through informal channels, without the systematic distribution network and without the invoice trail that made the current operation profitable at scale. Thomas Trevian knew the caves the way he knew his boat, the way he knew the tidal tables, as practical information accumulated over a lifetime of working the same water. His father had known the caves before him. Whether his father had used them in quite this way was a matter that Sergeant Bassett, who had known Thomas Trevian for 11 years, and felt the particular discomfort of having known something without knowing he knew it, preferred not to dwell on. Rowe had been introduced to the operation through a commercial contact in Plymouth, a man with connections in the wholesale spirits trade and a need for coastal access that was not under existing excise scrutiny. Rowe's particular skill, as his history in the Plymouth and Bristol operations suggested, was not logistics or physical work, but the construction of plausible contexts. He had the ability to make himself credible in a new setting quickly and thoroughly, which was in a professional sense his most valuable attribute, and in a personal sense the quality that made him difficult to detect. He had spent 3 months establishing himself in Polwheal before the operation reached the efficiency that made it worth the risk, and the 3 months had been used well. The cottage, the cover story, the bookshop visits, the conversations at the harbor, the growing social footprint of a person who is simply there and has been there long enough to be unremarkable. The smuggler's rhyme had been, Rowe later confirmed, a genuine discovery. He had borrowed the monograph from Penhallow's bookshop in his second week for reasons that were at the time purely performative, the kind of thing a maritime history researcher would do, and had read it on a Tuesday evening and had recognized, with what one might legitimately call professional delight, that the operational schedule it described was the schedule he had independently derived from his own assessment of the cave and the tides. He had adopted it as a mnemonic. It had the advantage of being memorizable and of appearing, to any observer, to be simply a picturesque piece of local lore. He had mentioned it to Thomas Trevian, who had been aware of the rhyme all his life, and who found it amusing that it was relevant. He had not found it amusing for long. James Kellaway had been tracking the Polwheal connection for 4 months before his death, following a pattern of excise irregularity in spirits distribution across 3 Cornish districts that had been identified by routine revenue analysis. The irregularity was consistent in its geography and its financial signature with a coastal transit operation of modest but sustained scale. Polwheal had been identified as a probable node point in July. Kellaway had begun informal enquiries in August, visiting the district without registering his presence, in the manner of an experienced officer who suspected that a formal enquiry would be flagged before it could produce results. He was a careful man. He had been in the village for 4 days before his death. He had spoken with the harbour master. He had spoken with 2 of the fishermen who used the low beach. He had spoken with Gregory Farr, Gerald Rowe, on Sunday afternoon, at the Anchor, apparently by chance, in the way that 2 men of broadly similar education and background sometimes fall into conversation in a village pub. Rowe had been, by Kellaway's documented notes, found in his lodgings in Truro after his death, helpful, knowledgeable, and interested in the historical aspects of coastal smuggling. Kellaway had noted him as a useful local contact. The notes also showed that Kellaway had, by Sunday evening, identified the tidal schedule he intended to observe on Monday night, based on the Polwheal harbour notice and his own assessment of the cave system. He had not yet identified the rime as operationally significant. He had simply worked out when the caves would be accessible and what a low-tide cave inspection might show. Rowe had read the notes, or had read enough of Kellaway's questions, to understand what Kellaway was looking for and how close he was. The tidal schedule Rowe had suggested to Kellaway, framed as a local observer's helpful clarification of the best conditions for a cave inspection, was the correct schedule. It was the schedule Rowe was also using on Monday night, having moved forward a delivery that had been planned for the following week, believing that if Kellaway was going to the cave, he could be in the cave at the same time, which was a simpler solution than the alternatives. The rock was already in the cave. It was part of the natural cave floor. Rowe had arrived first, which the schedule required, and he had waited in the part of the cave that curved away from the entrance in the dark. Kellaway had come in at the right time, following the schedule he had been given, with a torch and his notebook, and had gone approximately 8 feet into the cave before the torch beam reached the shelf. The rock was found afterward in a tidal pool behind the cave entrance. It carried trace evidence sufficient for the forensic examiner's purpose. Rowe was charged with murder. Thomas Trevian was charged with conspiracy to smuggle and with obstruction of a customs and excise officer, on the basis that he had known Kellaway was investigating and had failed to disclose this. Matthew Trevian, whose involvement in the physical operation was clear, but whose knowledge of Kellaway's death was genuinely limited to the discovery of Rowe's plan after it had been carried out, at which point Matthew had said nothing, which was a failure of a different kind, was charged separately on the smuggling counts. Mrs. Pengelly's case was referred to the district excise office, and her future, including the Anchor's license and the question of whether the premises might continue under new management, became a matter for proceedings that took considerably longer to resolve than the criminal case. Sergeant Bassett received a commendation from his superintendent for his management of the initial scene preservation, which he felt was generous. He was also commended, in Greaves's formal report, for his cooperation with the Truro inquiry, which he felt was accurate. D.C. Greaves's formal report named Miss Marple. This caused some internal discussion, in which the appropriate professional designation for a civilian's contribution was debated without resolution. The discussion was eventually set aside on the grounds that the name was in the report, and removing it would require a justification that nobody wished to write. The name remained. Chapter 10. The Rime Resolved. Mr. Penhallow came to Mrs. Carne's cottage on the Tuesday following the arrests, with a small package under his arm, and the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for a week and is ready to say it. The package contained his own working copy of the monograph, with extensive annotations in pencil, in the close handwriting of someone who has been going through a document very carefully and marking everything that looks different in retrospect. He had spent the previous week rereading the rime in light of what Miss Marple had shown him, with the particular thoroughness of a man who had built a part of his professional identity on this text, and now needed to understand where that identity stood. He had found, and said so without apparent distress, with the honesty of someone who has processed his disappointment privately, and arrived in her sitting room with the results, that every line of every stanza yielded to the operational interpretation in a way that the treasure interpretation never quite had. There had always been lines that were awkward in the treasure reading, lines he had explained in the monograph as poetic license, or as the natural imprecision of oral tradition, or as damage to the original text through transcription. They were not imprecise, they were not damaged, they were precise in a way that required you to know what they were describing. He sat down with the annotated monograph on his knees, and went through his notes, and she listened with the full attention of someone who was genuinely interested, because she was. The first stanza, he said, I had read as a romantic tableau, the headland, the moonlit cave, the sea keeping its secret. What it actually describes is an approach corridor, a tidal window, and a storage classification. All three are actionable information. None of it is romantic. The romance was the camouflage, Miss Marple said. Yes. He turned a page. The second stanza I had read as a ceremony, a marking of the spot, a kind of ritual associated with the original deposit. What it describes is an inventory protocol. The mark on the stone is a tally mark. The keeper is counting incoming goods and noting the count on the cave wall. The key running out with the morning tide is an exit deadline. He paused. I described this stanza, in my monograph, as the most evocative of the three. I use the word evocative in the sense of producing atmosphere. What it actually evokes is a working instruction set. It produces atmosphere too, she said, mildly. The two aren't incompatible. He considered this with the seriousness of a man who is not yet fully prepared to be consoled. The most remarkable thing, he said, is the third stanza's third line, below the shelf where no lantern swings. I always read that as poetic atmosphere, a dark, lampless cavern. But it's a location description of exceptional precision. There is a shelf in the third cave. I described it in the second edition, in a footnote on cave geology. A natural ledge, approximately 4 feet off the cave floor, on the right-hand wall, at the point where the cave curves. The reason no lantern swings there is structural. There is no overhead projection to hang one from. You would have to set a lamp on the floor, and the floor at that point is lower than the ledge by about 2 feet. The ledge is in a blind spot relative to the cave entrance. Goods stored on that ledge would not be visible from the entrance in lamplight. She agreed that this was very precise. The person who wrote this, Pengelly said, setting the monograph down, was not interested in legend or treasure. They were writing a reference document. They encoded operational instructions in verse, because verse is easier to memorize than a list of specifications, and because a piece of charming local folklore is less dangerous to carry than a set of smuggling instructions. He looked at his hands. It was, in its way, excellent technical writing, which is not what I said about it in the monograph. You said it was a remarkable example of coastal folk tradition, Miss Marple recalled, which it is. The two readings are not mutually exclusive. It is remarkable folk tradition. It is also a logistic specification. The people who wrote it presumably regarded both things as true simultaneously. It seemed to help, somewhat, as an observation. He asked whether she thought the caves would be sealed now. She said she thought they would be secured during the proceedings, at least. What happened afterward was not yet determined. The cliff path would almost certainly remain accessible, and the caves themselves might, in time, be opened again in some managed capacity. They were part of the village's history, after all, and now they were part of it in a way that was considerably more complicated, and considerably more interesting than the pirate gold version had been. He said he hoped the rhyme would survive as what it actually was, that the monograph would be revised, that the understanding of it would be corrected, that when local school children copied it out for FET programs in future years, they would know what they were copying. "I think that's very likely," she said. "Understanding the truth of something generally makes it more interesting, not less." The rhyme is rather more remarkable as a functional document that survived a century of misreading than it was as a romantic legend. "You might find the revision is the most read edition," he said, with a slight wryness that suggested he was beginning to recover, that this would depend entirely on how he wrote the introduction. She said she thought he would write it very well. She showed him to the door, and stood watching him walk back up the harbor lane, a small, precise figure with an annotated monograph under his arm, and the slightly lifted bearing of someone who has had a difficult thing confirmed, and has found the confirmation, on balance, useful. He would produce a new edition. It would have a very different footnote. The tide was coming in. She could hear it from the cottage doorstep. The sound of water, filling the cave mouths along the low beach. A sound that was not dramatic, but was continuous, and had been continuous for 300 years. The rhyme writer had heard it. The Trevians in every generation had heard it. Kellaway had heard it on the last evening of his life. Walking down the cliff path in the dark, with a torch and a schedule he had been given by the person who had written it. The sea came in and went out on its own schedule, without reference to the human arrangements conducted around it. It had been keeping the same tidal time for longer than the village had existed, and would keep it long after whatever the village decided to do with the caves had been decided and revised and decided again. She went back inside. Mrs. Carne had made tea and set out 2 blue china cups, waiting with the patient understanding of an old friend who has long since learned that Miss Marple's quietest moments were often her most active ones. "Is everything settled, Jane?" Mrs. Carne asked gently, passing her a cup. "I believe so, Dorothea," Miss Marple replied, taking a sip of the warm amber tea. "Everything is in order now. It is extraordinary how much trouble can be caused by people failing to look closely at what is right before their eyes. We are all so inclined to see what we expect to see, rather than what is actually there." She picked up her knitting needles again, the pale blue wool soft beneath her fingers. "And Mr. Penhallow?" "Oh, Mr. Penhallow is going to write a new edition," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "A very thorough new edition indeed. It will be a great success in the antiquarian circles, I am sure." Mrs. Carne agreed that it undoubtedly would. They sat together in the warm sitting room with the window slightly open, listening to the soft, rhythmic hush of the incoming tide against the granite quay, while the evening light faded over Polwheal harbour into a quiet, starry dusk. Neither of them found it necessary to say anything else for a very long time. And there you have it, a rhyme that a village read as a children's treasure hunt for 100 years, that turned out to be an instruction manual, and that was still being followed, line by line, stanza by stanza, on the title schedule its original author had built in, on the century-old Monday night. The treasure was real. It was just spirits, not gold. I've been sitting with this story for a while, and what stays with me isn't the murder, or even the rhyme. It's the idea of all those years of misreading. The school children copying it out. Mr. Penhallow building a career out of it. A whole village carrying a piece of information they didn't know was information. The most dangerous thing in the story was hiding in plain sight in a self-published antiquarian monograph, in a bookshop on the upper lane, available for anyone to borrow. Nobody read it with the right question. Now I'd love to hear from you. Has there been something in your own life, a saying, a family story, a thing you were told as a child, that turned out to mean something completely different once you knew the context? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and tonight's story has given me a great deal to think about on the subject of what we carry without knowing we're carrying it. And if Midnight Pages is where you come when you want a mystery that earns every moment of its ending, that puts every clue in front of you and trusts you to look carefully, then subscribe if you haven't. The next story is coming. This is David. Good night from Ohio. May the tides bring back what they keep, and may you always read the old rhymes twice.